June 2023 marked a turning point on the streets of South Los Angeles. Within the span of only a few weeks, two men tied to the same organization were taken out, silenced not by rivals or strangers, but by the very man entrusted to lead them. These weren't random killings, Barisha. They were executions ordered from inside, revealing a truth about the way power is maintained in one of LA's most entrenched gangs. Florence Avenue runs like a scar across the south side of the city. It's here that Florencia 13, known simply as F13, first took shape during the 1940s. What started as a neighborhood crew of Mexican-American teenagers protecting their block slowly transformed into something far more lethal. Over decades, it grew into a structure that now commands several square miles, with thousands of members operating under its control. This isn't a loose street gang anymore. It's a criminal machine wired directly to the Mexican mafia, the real authority behind the curtain, pulling strings from prison yards. Every dollar of drug money, every act of discipline, every neighborhood dispute ultimately funnels upward to those higher powers. To understand why members were killed in 2023, you have to understand how the system is built. Florencia 13 functions like a corporation, but in this company, discipline isn't measured in warnings or suspensions. Here, punishment is final. At the top are the shot callers, men who prove themselves through years of violence and unquestioned loyalty. Beneath them are tax collectors who squeeze money out of anyone moving drugs on gang turf. Below them are the soldiers, younger men trying to make a name. At the very bottom are the hangers-on, bodies that can be used and discarded when needed. The rules are strict, and they don't bend. Taxes must be paid, orders must be followed. No one talks to the police. Anyone who hesitates, disrespects, or betrays is handled immediately. And the one who enforces those rules is often someone like the man known on the streets as Busy. Busy built his reputation by being everywhere collecting money, punishing violations, keeping order with an iron hand. By 2022, his calm demeanor and relentless efficiency had made him one of the most feared shot callers in F13. To the gang, he wasn't just following the code, he was the code. His word carried the weight of judgment, and his actions served as examples carved into the lives of anyone who watched. But what Busy didn't realize was that his methods were also leaving behind a trail of witnesses, evidence, and patterns. The same violence he believed kept his organization alive was slowly stitching together a case against him. And when federal agents closed in, it wasn't the power he built that defined him, but the evidence he left behind. Florencia 13's origins reach back more than 70 years. In the 1940s, the gang was little more than a tight circle of young Mexican-American men who banded together for protection. They hung around Florence Avenue, defending their neighborhood from outsiders. What began as small skirmishes and territorial pride would, over decades, grow into a full-scale criminal network. By the 1980s and 90s, F13 had spread across South Los Angeles. The group had evolved past fistfights and graffiti. Now, they controlled entire stretches of territory with drug sales, extortion, and violence. At its height, the gang boasted thousands of members. The organization had become less about community defense and more about feeding money into a larger system, the Mexican Mafia, or La M, who pulled the strings from behind prison walls. F13 operated like a business, but not the kind you'd see in daylight. Its model was clear. The Mexican Mafia set directives. Shot callers on the outside enforced them. Tax collectors gathered the payments. Soldiers executed the orders. Associates carried out the dirty work. Each level fed into the one above it, creating a chain where disobedience was never tolerated. The code within this structure was brutally simple. Pay the taxes you owe, respect the hierarchy, Never cooperate with police. Never show weakness. Breaking these rules wasn't just frowned upon, it was fatal. There were no second chances, no warnings. Justice inside F13 was swift and absolute. Busy was the embodiment of that justice. His real name was known to authorities, but on the streets he was simply Busy. The nickname came from his constant activity. He was always moving, always handling business, collecting dues, checking on operations, disciplining those who slipped. His quiet, composed exterior hid a readiness to use violence at a moment's notice. By the early 2020s, Busy had carved out a reputation as one of F13's most effective enforcers. He wasn't flashy, he didn't boast, but people knew better than to cross him. For the younger soldiers, he represented the path forward, proof that loyalty and brutality could elevate a man's standing. For rivals and even fellow members, he was a figure of fear. It wasn't just his willingness to hurt people that made him dangerous. It was how methodical he was. Punishments weren't random bursts of anger. They were calculated demonstrations. If someone held back drug profits, Busy would make sure the beating happened in public. If a soldier showed disrespect, the retaliation would be swift and visible. Each act reinforced the unwritten law: betrayal equals destruction. This approach served two purposes. It reinforced order within F13, keeping money flowing upward, and it spread fear outward, silencing communities who might otherwise resist. Residents of South Los Angeles knew the rules, even those who had nothing to do with the gang. You paid if you were told to pay. You stayed quiet if you saw something you weren't meant to see. Law enforcement had long struggled to contain F13. In 2007, a federal crackdown known as Operation Joker's Wild indicted more than 100 members. The charges included shootings, extortion, and racially motivated attacks. To many, it seemed like the gang should have collapsed under the weight of that operation. But F13 adapted. They learned from their mistakes. Leaders instructed members not to leave witnesses, not to speak openly on phones, and to handle internal problems quietly before the authorities noticed. By the time Busy was climbing the ranks, F13 had reorganized. The gang was leaner, smarter, more secretive, but discipline was still crucial, and discipline required fear. Busy became the tool for that fear. He enforced order not just for himself, but for the entire system, ensuring that the chain of command remained unbroken. To outsiders, the organization might have looked like chaos, street fights, drug deals, random violence, but inside, it was anything but random. It was structured, efficient, and intentional, and at the center of that enforcement was Busy, a man whose reputation made even hardened gang members think twice. Yet the very discipline that lifted him to power also carried the seeds of his undoing. Fear may control people for a time, but it doesn't erase mistakes. It doesn't prevent whispers, and it doesn't stop investigators from watching. Busy believed he was strengthening the organization. In reality, every act of enforcement he carried out was building a trail, one that federal agents were quietly following, step by step. October 2022, a bar in South Los Angeles. The night was quiet until a man tied to Florencia 13 made a mistake. Exactly what rule he broke remains unclear. Maybe he skimmed drug profits. Maybe he mouthed off to the wrong person. Maybe law enforcement had gotten too close. In this world, the reason didn't matter. Violation was enough. Busy arrived with another member known as Creeper. They weren't there to negotiate, armed with baseball bats. They set upon the man in the open, blows echoing through the dark street. When he fell, the beating didn't stop. Strike after strike turned the punishment into a performance, one meant to be remembered. Those who witnessed it understood the message. This is what happens when you cross Florencia 13. The victim lived, but the scars he carried served as a walking reminder of what discipline looked like under Busy's control. For Busy, this assault wasn't just retaliation, it was a test run, a signal to everyone that order would be maintained by force within months. Rumors spread through the hierarchy that discipline was slipping, soldiers were becoming complacent, corners were being cut, and money wasn't flowing the way it should. To the Mexican mafia, disorder was unacceptable. To Busy, restoring fear was the solution. Summer 2023 became the breaking point. On June 19th, a seasoned member of F13, someone with years of service to the gang, was found dead. On the streets, he was known as RA. His status should have protected him, but in the world of Florencia 13, longevity is no shield. Whether he pocketed too much tax money, spoke to the wrong people, or simply looked weak, the end result was the same. Busy decided he had to go. With another enforcer at his side, the execution was carried out. No trial, no appeals, just swift elimination. The impact was immediate. Fear rippled through the ranks. If a veteran could be erased overnight, then nobody was untouchable. Payments suddenly appeared on time. Soldiers lowered their heads, avoided questions, and obeyed without hesitation. Busy's message was loud and clear: survival depended on obedience. But the blood didn't stop there. 2 weeks later, in July, another member was targeted, known as DE. He had also strayed from the rigid code. Maybe he questioned leadership, maybe he tried to carve out independence. Whatever the reason, he was marked. This time, Busy wasn't alone. Another associate, known as Threat, joined him. The killing was deliberate. The body left as proof of what happened to those who forgot their place. Unlike attacks on rivals, these murders struck at the gang's core. They weren't about territory or competition. They were about terrorizing the group's own members, making loyalty a matter of life and death. For soldiers under F13, the fear was suffocating. Each night carried the question, would tomorrow bring a knock at the door, a ride in a car that never came back, or the same fate as RA and DE? By late July, Florencia 13 had become a climate of paranoia. Discipline was tighter, money flowed upward again, and disputes vanished. From the perspective of the Mexican mafia, the strategy was working. Busy's campaign of fear had reasserted control. But with every strike, every killing, he was also leaving behind witnesses, trails of evidence, and patterns too obvious to ignore. Because fear can silence communities, but it cannot erase the traces left behind, and in the shadows, federal investigators were already watching. The FBI had never lost sight of Florencia 13. For years, agents had tracked the gang's movements, studying its structure and documenting its crimes. They knew who collected taxes, who supplied the drugs, and who enforced the rules. But knowing and proving are two different things. What they needed was evidence that tied murders directly to the organization's leadership. Busy's violent summer in 2023 gave them just that. Every crime leaves something behind. A cell phone ping showing location, a passing camera catching a car, a neighbor who remembers seeing a face. Busy and his crew believed their actions were silencing problems, but what they were really doing was gift-wrapping evidence. For investigators, the killings weren't just violence, they were case studies in organized crime. Federal investigations don't move quickly. They move methodically, brick by brick. Agents recruited informants. Some flipped after minor arrests, others motivated by fear or revenge. Wiretaps picked up snippets of conversation the gang thought were safe. Surveillance teams tracked meetings in cars and on street corners. Each fragment by itself was small. Together, they built a picture that was hard to deny. By late 2023, prosecutors had quietly convened a grand jury. Behind closed doors, witnesses gave testimony, documents were presented, and recordings were played piece by piece. The narrative emerged. Florencia 13 wasn't just a neighborhood gang, it was a criminal enterprise tied directly to the Mexican mafia, and Busy was enforcing its rules through bloodshed. The legal weapon chosen was RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. It was designed for cases like this. Under RICO, prosecutors didn't need to prove Busy himself pulled the trigger each time. They only needed to show he was part of the organization that carried out the murders. The structured hierarchy, the tax system, the code of silence, all of it made Florencia 13 a perfect target. For months, the case built in secret while Busy continued to believe his control was secure. Then, in August 2024, the silence ended. Before sunrise, South Los Angeles erupted in coordinated raids. Federal agents in tactical gear, backed by local police, swept across dozens of locations. Doors were kicked in, flashbangs shattered the dark, suspects were pulled from their beds. 37 names were listed on the indictment. 23 were taken into custody that morning. Several were already locked up on other charges. Others fled, their faces soon appearing on wanted posters. The raids didn't just net people. They pulled in the infrastructure of the enterprise. More than 20 pounds of methamphetamine, 9 pounds of fentanyl, over 6 pounds of heroin. These weren't user amounts, they were wholesale quantities, proof of large-scale distribution. Alongside the drugs were stacks of cash, around $70,000. Not a fortune, but enough to demonstrate the constant flow of profits. Firearms were also seized: pistols, rifles, and shotguns. Some were stolen, others had serial numbers filed off. Ballistic tests later connected several of them to unsolved shootings from years past. Each weapon was another charge, another link in the chain tying F13 to a legacy of violence. But at the core of the indictment were the killings. Prosecutors laid out the October 2022 assault, the June 2023 murder of R.A., and the July 2023 murder of D.E. Each was documented with surveillance, testimony, phone records, and forensic detail. Each pointed to Busy, to the federal government. These weren't isolated acts. They were part of a pattern, a system of using murder to maintain control. For Busy and his co-defendants, the charges were devastating. Conspiracy under RICO, murder in aid of racketeering, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, firearms violations, assault with dangerous weapons. Each count carried years, some decades, some life sentences. Stacked together, they amounted to a guarantee that none of the men would walk free again. The irony was unavoidable. Busy's role had been to protect the organization by enforcing order. Every violent act he carried out to prove loyalty became a brick in the wall the FBI built around him. His system of control, designed to preserve the gang, became the evidence that dismantled him. Inside the federal system, outcomes are rarely uncertain. The conviction rate in cases like this sits above 90%. Once the indictment dropped, Busy's fate was essentially sealed. His lawyers could argue that he was a product of his environment, that he acted under orders from higher authorities within the Mexican mafia, that he was just another soldier in a larger machine. But the evidence spoke louder. Witnesses, surveillance, intercepted calls all pointed back to him. For Busy, the violent summer of 2023 had written the end of his story. Every murder justified as discipline was reclassified as racketeering. Every act of enforcement he believed preserved order became proof of criminal conspiracy. No amount of loyalty, no adherence to the code could shield him from the weight of federal charges. He was looking at life in prison, with no possibility of parole. His co-defendants faced similar realities. Some cracked under the pressure, offering cooperation in exchange for lighter sentences. Others chose silence, clinging to the gang's code even as it condemned them to decades behind bars. But whether they talked or stayed quiet, the result was the same: the organization they had killed for would move on without them. New soldiers would replace them, new shot callers would emerge, and Florencia 13 would continue operating in the shadows. For the families of RA and DE, there was no justice that could undo the damage. RA's mother struggled to understand how her son could be murdered by men he once called brothers. DE's friends remembered him as someone who wanted a way out, someone who may have been searching for change. That desire for escape likely marked him as a liability. His death was the price of trying to leave. Both men left behind loved ones' children who would grow up without fathers, partners who would wake to empty spaces, families carrying grief mixed with shame. In South Los Angeles, the murders reinforced what residents had known for decades: the streets were ruled by fear. People who had nothing to do with gangs lived under an invisible law: keep your head down, don't speak out, and never ask questions. Each killing reinforced silence. Each body was another reminder that even loyalty offered no guarantee of survival. The paradox of Busy's rise and fall was stark. The very violence he believed kept order had dismantled the organization from within. Fear can be effective in the short term. It brings obedience. It restores discipline, but it also creates resentment, mistrust, and witnesses. Busy's campaign of terror made soldiers pay their taxes and follow orders, but it also drew the FBI's attention, creating the trail that sealed his fate. His cure became the disease. For the community, the cycle felt endless. The raids in 2024 brought temporary relief, but they didn't erase decades of trauma. Children had grown up watching bodies on the pavement, hearing gunfire at night, and learning rules of survival before they ever entered a classroom. Mothers carried constant anxiety. Fathers wrestled with the knowledge that they could not protect their families. The gang's presence was like smog, always there, choking, but impossible to escape. Even law enforcement knew the problem wasn't solved. Arresting Busy and his crew disrupted operations, but it didn't dismantle the roots of Florencia 13. The vacuum created by the arrests quickly filled. Younger members saw opportunities to rise. Rivals sensed weakness. The Mexican mafia, operating from prison, selected new enforcers to restore order. The cycle continued, reshaping but never ending. Busy had believed that killing his own men was an act of loyalty, a way to preserve the gang's strength. But in truth, it exposed its weakness. An organization that survives by destroying its own members is already crumbling. The fear that once made Busy powerful ensured his downfall. And in the end, the man who thought he was preserving the Brotherhood had destroyed it from within. Today, Busy sits in federal custody, awaiting the kind of trial that rarely ends in acquittal. His life will almost certainly conclude behind concrete walls. His name reduced to a file number, his influence stripped away. Yet the organization he tried to protect will not disappear with him. Florencia 13 has weathered crackdowns before. It has adapted to raids, indictments, and leadership changes. Removing one man, even a shot caller, is never enough to kill the machine. On the streets of South Los Angeles, daily life goes on. For most residents, the federal sweep brought a sense of relief. Guns and drugs were taken off the streets. Violent figures were locked away. But the relief is temporary. The absence of one power structure leaves a vacuum, and vacuums do not last long. What? New names will rise, new soldiers will be recruited, and the cycle will repeat itself. The deeper tragedy lies with the families left behind, the mothers who bury their sons, the children who grow up asking why their fathers are gone, the partners who must carry grief in silence. There are no support groups for families of gang members killed by their own, no counselors prepared to explain how loyalty turned into betrayal. Their mourning is private, marked by stigma, shame, and unanswered questions. Busy's story also forces a broader question: what does brotherhood mean in a system where loyalty is proven by death? He believed he was preserving order, that every act of violence was a necessity. To him, executions weren't betrayals, they were maintenance. But in reality, his loyalty hollowed out the very foundation he swore to defend. Fear created obedience, but it also created cracks. And those cracks became the evidence that dismantled him. The cycle ensures new generations are drawn in, somewhere in South Los Angeles. A teenager is making choices similar to the ones Busy once made. He sees the older members with money, respect, and control. He doesn't know the names of RA or DE, nor the details of the federal raids. He only knows that the gang offers something the rest of the world has denied him: identity, power, belonging. Unless his path changes, his future is already written. That is the enduring paradox of street life. Every member understands the likely outcomes: prison, death, or irrelevance. And yet, they continue. Because in neighborhoods starved of opportunity, power through fear feels like a better option than invisibility. Busy chose to be feared rather than forgotten, to be the one handing out punishment rather than receiving it. For a while, it worked. But the power he believed he held was always an illusion, a temporary loan destined to be reclaimed. Busy's downfall is not just the story of one man, it is a mirror reflecting the cycle of loyalty, violence, and survival that defines countless gangs across America. Until the roots are cut: poverty, neglect, absence of opportunity. The same story will be told again and again. Different names, different streets, but the same ending.